Join us in the fight to restore liberty and American exceptionalism. Together, let's make the case that our charters of freedom are worth defending and honoring. Right here is where the great American experiment comes alive. Let's get to work.
Question 3, the affirmative argument will be by Mr. Weisser. The question is, oh, by the way, I want to point out, all of that last question, you saw how there were a lot of words expressed on that 8th Amendment. And you know how many words the 8th Amendment has? 16. Those 16 words took 20 minutes. All right, here we go. Question number 3. Should the 14th Amendment be used as a justification for abortion? Affirmative argument, Mr. Weisser, you have 4 minutes.
I'm going to argue that the concept of birth control up to and including abortion are in line and in keeping with the values and the stated positions of the Constitution. In particular, we point out the 14th Amendment, but I find more relevance in the 4th Amendment, which, while dealing with the rights of search and seizure, protects a person's person. We have the right to our person, we have the right to our personal decisions. Now, when it comes to the idea of abortion, which is terminating a pregnancy, ending a fetus, the question comes to a religious issue. Some religions establish that life begins at conception, when the first egg meets when the first sperm meets the egg, and that is the moment of an individual. And yet, when we look at biology, we find that egg cannot go to work even for minimum wage, that fetus has no existence separate of the woman's body. Not long ago, a former employee of mine, or boss of mine, wife, had to have surgery. It turned out that she had a tumor in her uterus that was 21 years old. This tumor in her uterus had hair, it had teeth, it even had eyes. But it was not an individual, it was a part of the woman's body. And as that woman, she had the right to privacy to decide what she wished to do with her body. In much the same way as people have elective surgeries to this day. Now, if we're going to say that it's about the sanctity of life, then we can't conversely argue that the 8th Amendment gives us the power to take away life of people that we find morally reprehensible. When it comes to the right of a person to determine their biology, I believe that is sacrosanct in the American Constitution and our values of equality. Certainly, if you look at the history of abortion in the world, it goes all the way back to Egypt. It shows up spontaneously in other creatures, and birth control, elimination of unwanted pregnancies, is a natural occurrence that's going to happen whether or not we have laws that protect it. Luckily, the United States Constitution gives us the right of privacy. The United States Constitution gives us protection from other people's religions being enforced on our decisions. And as far as I'm concerned, I assert that the United States Constitution protects the right of birth control up to and including abortion.
Okay, we'll have a negative cross-examination, 1 minute, Mr. Krauser.
Mr. Weisser, I just want to be clear. You have a moral objection to executing depraved murderers after they've been provided due process of law. Is that true?
I'm not sure that is true, what you just said, because my objection to the death penalty is cases where due process has not been followed.
But you also said that you object to the death penalty ever being utilized. You said even if it was your own child.
Yes, I actually said my grandchild, which is even
So
more
you object to the death penalty?
Yes, sir, I do.
But you have no problem executing an innocent child who is in the womb of a fetus, the womb of a mother, who has not been provided due process of law.
I object to you insisting that your religious values trump mine.
Nobody brought religion in there. I'm asking you. You're going to answer the question, Mr. Weisser. No, Mr. Weisser. You're going to answer.
You changed the definition of who we're talking about.
With all due respect, this is my cross-examination. I'd like you to answer the question.
Yes.
Okay. Are you saying that you are okay taking the life of a fetus who has not been provided due process of law in accordance with the 5th and 14th Amendments?
I am saying that the fetus is a part of the woman and that is her decision.
So your answer is no.
You're going to have to ask me the question.
Yeah, that's what I thought. We'll just move along.
Okay, well, that's 1 minute, and next we have a negative argument, 5 minutes, Mr. Krauser.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the interesting irony of this all. We heard from Mr. Weisser for 10 minutes nearly, telling us about the government might get it wrong sometimes. We want to make sure that justice is served. We don't want to execute the innocent. Get rid of the death penalty. The 8th Amendment requires it. And maybe if we get around to the 5th and 14th Amendment, that might require it too. All of this nonsense that we heard from Mr. Weisser about how we should be protecting individuals who have been accused of murder, even after being provided due process. But an innocent baby should not be afforded that same protection. That is the irony of this all. Don't try and suggest that a person cannot coincide taking the life of a murderer and protecting the life of an innocent human being. It's all about due process. You know, here is, if we want to talk about the founders and what's gone on historically, and ultimately this is a contest about what the Constitution has to say. It was Thomas Jefferson who said, "The care of human life, not their destruction, is the first and only legitimate objective of good government." The fact of the matter is Roe v. Wade stands for a very ugly proposition. Don't be fooled. On the one hand, it says that a child can be aborted up to and including when that child is viable. That is, it can sustain life on its own. But it also makes it very clear that the child can be taken at any time if the doctor determines that it's for the mother's health. The fact of the matter is it is intellectually dishonest, it's disingenuous to suggest that this fetus is not a human being. From the moment that the sperm and the egg come together, there is the beginning of a metabolism. There's beginning of growth. In 16 days, there's a heart rate that can be detected. At 6 weeks, there are brain waves that can be detected. The unborn baby has a distinct, unchanging, unrepeatable genetic code. It will not become a tree. It will not become a shoe. It will not become a dog. It will become a human being. And simply because Mr. Weisser and those of his ilk do not identify as somebody that looks like you and me, relatively unidentifiable at 6, 8, 12 weeks, it is not worthy of protection. Nothing could be more contemptible under our Constitution. I believe that our founders would simply be rolling over to hear that these things are being advocated and that our Supreme Court ultimately decided that innocent life could be taken, that we erred on the side of death, and as a result we are becoming a culture of death. We've killed 55 million innocent lives. Don't sit here and tell me, well, we've got a handful of individuals that have been killed who are on death row. Don't sit here and make that argument to me. Let's talk about the 55 million innocent lives that have ultimately been taken. It's the Declaration of Independence that makes it very clear. Endowed by their Creator with life. The 5th Amendment, due process of law must be satisfied before life is taken. 14th Amendment, due process must be satisfied before life is taken. Here you have one individual determining what will happen with another individual's life, and yet Mr. Weisser spent all kinds of time over the last hour talking about tyranny of the majority. This sounds like tyranny of the majority to me. And let's look at the natural law. The natural law is what our Constitution was grounded in. It's what it was founded upon. The natural law is simply the simple order of things, the natural order of things. It was John Locke, who was very influential to our founders, who said, such actions as not to kill another man, not to procure abortion, not to take from another what is his. He's the one who wrote this. He's the individual, one of many individuals who influenced our founders. It was Charles Montesquieu who said, "There are among savages another custom. It is the cruel practice of abortion to which some women are addicted." Think about that. The very individuals who influenced our founders. Natural law writers such as Locke, Pufendorf, and Montesquieu all were in agreement that abortion at any stage of pregnancy was contrary to the law of nature and that the unborn should be protected from the moment of conception. What about double homicide? Isn't it interesting that if you don't want the child, you can abort it in our culture? But at the same time, if the mother does want the child, a criminal can go down for double homicide? Isn't that interesting? The hypocrisy that one individual gets to determine whether or not that fetus is a glob of cells or a human being. If we want to talk about the Constitution, let's talk about the Constitution. There's no question what it ultimately supports and what it does not condone.
Okay, thank you. Affirmative cross-examination, 1 minute, Mr. Weisser.
Mr. Krauser, do you believe that citizens should be forced to pray to Mecca 7 times a day?
Pray to who?
Do you believe that citizens should be forced to pray to Mecca 7 times a day?
No.
Do you believe that students must be taught that Jesus rode on dinosaurs?
No.
So why do you insist on subjecting other issues to your specific religious values?
How do you even know that I'm a religious individual?
Because when you...
I did not inject religion into this conversation, Mr. Weisser.
Mr. Krauser, when you take what's existing statute in Roe v. Wade and change it to from fetus to child, from fetus to baby, from embryo to child and baby, then aren't you establishing your religious values?
No, I'm establishing a matter of science.
Science says that a fetus does not exist, is not an individual until it is viable.
Is that right? So viability determines whether or not it is a human being? Is that what your argument is?
That's what Roe v. Wade 1972
I'm asking you what your argument is.
That's the stance that I'm taking, yes.
Okay. I'll reserve my time for rebuttal.
All right. That being said, we have the affirmative rebuttal. Mr. Krause, Mike, you have 5 minutes.
Once again, as much as I respect the idea of having religious values celebrated, I don't think that we need to have them enforced on our society. Again, I hear the groans out there of people who are happy to protect an unborn fetus at the same time that they will be blithely allowing people to die in poverty and die without health care, and say that that's also their vision of justice in America. When it comes to religion, First Amendment makes it clear that we're not going to have somebody else's religious values impressed upon our interpretation. I don't care how unjust you think my religious sense of freedom is, you do not get to impress that saying that because my God says that conception is the beginning of an individual, that from now on, everybody who has a miscarriage needs to go to prison. Because obviously, how do we know that that's not the woman's intention to murder her unborn child? We don't. Viability was established in 1973 through Roe versus Wade, and we've seen repeated cases since then where people trying to say that they're talking about morality are just insisting on putting their religious values in front of other people's. I do not believe that you should have the right to determine whether or not a woman chooses to have birth control. Up until 1972, birth control at all was considered illegal in much of the United States, and so why are you going to say that that is a way to have a positive society? When you change people to their biological imperatives, then you don't have justice, you take away women's freedom, and I do not think that we should have a society that's based on taking away women's freedom at this very basic level.
Thank you. Negative rebuttal. Mr. Krause, you have 4 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the argument, and I think it's rather clear. Introducing religion into the conversation makes it for a relatively easy target for Mr. Weisser, but nobody brought religion up other than Mr. Weisser. Not once did it happen. But you know what? Here was what I think he's getting at. And he's saying you can't legislate morality. That's what he's getting at. The fact of the matter is we legislate morality every single day throughout this country, and justifiably so. Murder is a moral position, and it's outlawed in our society. So is rape, so is robbery, so is burglary, so is trespass, so is assault. Those are all moral positions that we've taken as a society. So whether it comes from a religious foundation or not doesn't ultimately matter. What I hear Mr. Weisser saying is that if you introduce religion into a debate, that somehow you're a knuckle-dragging Nazi and you don't deserve to be a part of the discussion any longer. That's part of the problem in this country. He advocates freedom, but not the freedom to speak from the perspective of a religious individual. That's the irony of this. We're not talking about children being taught that Jesus rode on dinosaurs or that individuals should have to pray in a certain direction. That's not what we're being talked about. We're not talking about that issue. What we're talking about is when another individual's liberties are being infringed upon, that is an appropriate function of government. Here you have another liberty, specifically a life, that is being infringed upon. And it is certainly justifiable for government to intervene under those circumstances. Don't you find it ironic that all of the arguments that were advocated by Mr. Weisser had to do with situations that are relatively rare, whether it be health of the mother, whether it be rape, whether it be incest? Why didn't we talk about what happens well over 95% of the time, which is abortions being done out of inconvenience? The child would simply be inconvenient, so I will abort that child. And we often hear the arguments. If we were to let Mr. Weisser talk a bit longer, we would have heard things like, well, are you willing to step up and adopt these children? Are you willing to step up? That's like saying that unless you employ ex-slaves in your business, you have no right to oppose slavery. I'm going to be involved in this argument whether or not I'm willing to adopt or not. Why? Because a life is ultimately at stake. And when we talk about pro-choice, think about what that ultimately means. Nothing could be further from the truth when we're talking about what this position represents. The choice was already made in well over 95% of those situations. What we're talking about is the want to avoid the consequences of that choice. You had the choice to jump in the sack, but after the fact, there are consequences that ultimately have to be adhered to. There seems to be this idea of Roe v. Wade suggesting that it's okay. I take the position that just because 9 men and women on the Supreme Court say something doesn't necessarily mean it's right. In fact, we just had a debate last week on the Second Amendment. The U.S. Supreme Court says that the individual has a right to bear arms. So is he now conceding that the court got that one right too? I don't think so. We're not arguing whether or not the U.S. Supreme Court got it right. What we're talking about is in matters of principle. What does the Constitution have to say about this particular issue? And I take you back to the 5th Amendment, to the 14th Amendment. It's unmistakably clear. Life cannot be taken without due process of law. Thank you.
Thank you very much.